Hello there, my name is Richard Fisher and I'm going to talk about a local history walk, but the theme, or element I should say, is air, and this is around the Stoke Village area of Plymouth. So we have some very few images of Stoke. We know what the terrain's like, but we have very few paintings, detailed paintings, and most of the paintings we do have date from about the 1680s, and they're showing you the general landscape. And yet you can see, even from the Saxon times up to the 1680s, 1690s and onwards, even up to the Victorian period, it was mostly farmland, as it always has been. Looking at Stoke from the air, we get wonderful maps showing you details of all the fields and all the elements that really make the lovely little village that it is. And it still retains today that sort of sense of being, belonging, and that's what this whole thing's about, trying to interpret what the past was like in Stoke, because Stoke Village has a unique sort of sense to it, let's say an air to it, a real sort of feeling. But let's look at our ancestors. Air to the ancestors is really quite a mysterious thing. All the elements were quite mysterious and they weren't explained properly. I mean, when you look at air, you can't see it. You can feel it. It makes strange shapes in the sky. It does things that it needs explaining. So what you had was a belief that it's something else moving things, or something else creating things. And this was probably a being. And we know from the medieval period, chap from Italy, I think it was, who came up with these elements as beings. And this one is called the Tithe, or the wild man. So what we got is elements of, imagine back in time, let's say back in the past when we couldn't explain things, we looked at the sky, we could see shapes, things moving, we could hear things as well. And also it's a time when we always have storms. There's something up in the air that might create something that we're not happy with. It gets cold, it gets dark at the wrong time. It's not helping with the fields, the crops, that sort of thing. There must be something at fault. Is somebody upset with us? Something in the air. Things like that would have mystical beings flying around, or something tangible. Okay, we can't see it, but there must be something out there that we could see if only we could find it. And sometimes there was the idea of witches flying around, and with these witches you could stop these witches because they did fly all over the place, but they didn't use roads or lanes like we know today. What our ancestors thought was the byways were actually the hedgerows. And the hedgerows, the only way to stop these witches was actually put in a holly bush, because they didn't like holly at all. So holly bushes you would often find intertwined with a hedgerow to stop the witches flying around. You did have the sort of, as you know, if you go into the countryside, especially in the autumn time or in the summer, you get the nice breeze coming across you. But sometimes you walk into the woods and it gets a bit dark, and suddenly this gust of wind comes right through the trees, and the trees' leaves make a noise like a whisper. Is that somebody talking to us? That sort of sense of the wind interacting with something that we can't see. So it was that belief that a wind is doing something. Okay, even with crops, with a field, you can imagine a field of corn or wheat, and it's a summer's day, but you get that odd little wave of wind that would change the wave, the movement of the field, and it looks like a wave. And people were scared of that. They thought it was some sort of being coming across the field, across the land. So they had a sense of being that there's something in the wind, something in the air. Meanwhile, up in the air, the good thing about air was that people used to like looking at birds, and birds had magical things about them as well. Every part of Devon or Cornwall, up and down the country, had different names for each type of bird. I mean, today we have common names like a robin or a sparrow, But each little village and place would have their own particular names for particular birds, and they would have their own folklore, particularly with birds. And don't forget, birds would, we know today, would travel miles to come to us through the air, and it would be lovely to see them again and again, because then that they would know something to do with the seasons as well. Okay, so even the air was telling them that the seasons are changing, even though other elements would tell them so. But when you get certain birds coming along, you know that there's certain birds will come in at a certain time of the year through the air. Now, having that, it was like a gift from God, having birds, because a lot of people used to do what we don't do now, which is larking, going for birds' nests. So birds' nests was collected from these sort of flying beings as well, and we would eat all these birds as well. We eat more birds then than we do now. We have a Pacific, like chicken, turkey, that sort of thing. But in the old days, you would eat most birds. So with birds, I mean, birds were sort of like well praised. I mean, they had special pies with birds. I mean, we know from 24 blackbirds baked in a pie, and today we think, oh, that's terrible. But yes, they did have that sort of thing. Birds within birds, stuffed within birds, and then beautifully sliced. Birds were like a staple food, like fish and things like that. But we don't really harvest birds like in the medieval period. They came during the season, so it was nice to look forward to some geese coming along from the air, thinking, all good. Then we've got some food coming from the air. The gods have given us something special. Training birds is the other thing is that a lot of people got into, especially medieval period, and it was brought over really by the Normans, imposing their ways of like stock keeping hold of animals. But falconry really became a thing of sort of like an art of training birds and things. Some people actually think it comes way back to Mongolia, possibly China, and that's possibly true. The other thing is also, if you can train birds, you can then domesticate them. So with that, in our past, at one point in time, we could domesticate these birds that didn't really tend to fly too far away. You could clip their wings, that sort of thing. But really, you're still retaining the food, you're still getting the eggs. But that's really for a small, sort of like domestic fowl, as it were. I mean, the similar ones that you do get wild is pheasants, that sort of thing. So they're still around today, but you're not allowed to shoot them, I understand. Okay, sticking with the theme of air, so we're going to change as well, because as you know, Stoke, right next door to Devonport, which was founded and really put together in 1693. Then you've got Plymouth, way back in time, and all the fishing villages all along the coast. But really, Plymouth established itself as a sort of naval base, and then with bigger ships, and thanks to William III, that we have Devonport, and then even bigger ships. And with that, the Navy really had a firm foundation down here. And really, the Navy couldn't go anywhere, nor could any ship really, without air, without the sails. The beauty is that down here we have a lot of flax for clothes and things like that, so we can make really reasonable sails for big ships. And if it wasn't for air, really, and sailing, we wouldn't be able to explore. And that was the other thing that Plymouth had. It was a real key place to start sailing out to explore countries like what we now know is America, all the way down to the bottom of Africa and over to Australia. As we know, most of our explorers started from here. However, being air, as we know, was talked about earlier, up on our hill in Stoke, that's fine, but going to sea, there are other elements at sea that are quite scary, i.e. the storms, the sirens, i.e. that's the sound of the wind blowing. You do get gales on land, but there is a certain sound at sea that sounds like a real skrill, a banshee, as they say in Ireland. Okay, it's a real singing sound. But that is also part of the wind giving you the idea that things are not too good at the moment. I mean, that's the other thing that wind gives us as well. It is dangerous. When it's dangerous, it's best to hunker down or keep under cover. So we got some famous explorers here. This is by Tobias Furneaux. I hope I got that correct. Now, he was the first man, really. He was born up at Swilly, and he was the first man to circumnavigate the world both ways. Now, that sounds interesting because once it's with the wind, if you can understand what I'm saying, but then sailing against the wind is more difficult, especially for tacking and that sort of thing. So he was able to do that. So he had the skill of using the wind to navigate fantastically for the first time. Okay, so another thing that's in the air, as we looked at, was ancient beliefs and religions. Was at one point the whole of the West Country came under the puritanical sort of religion, and things became very staid, very sort of conformist. Christmas was banned. Nobody was allowed to sing. All sorts of things like that. So it was like contagious things, but to have them preached to you, a lot of roving priests and church people at the time would go around and do open air sermons and open air preaching. Now, this was quite unusual, really, for because most people went to church, but tiny little villages like Stoke didn't have a church at the top, would have had a little visit now and again where people had preached them a new type of religion. And this carried on until we have the Wesleyan period of Methodism. So when we had that come along, and that came in the 1780s, we had already a thriving Devonport with lots of pubs and lots of drinking going on, Stonehouse and Plymouth as well. So when these people came along to this sort of puritanical still relationship, but it was starting to change, especially in the 1780s, these people came along with their idea of open air preaching, big style. And they tried to establish the idea of keeping the faith, the puritanical faith still. A lot of it was, a lot of the times they were sort of stoned and heckled, especially in Devonport. But they tended to find little pockets of places where they could do their open air business. And one of them, we're absolutely sure about, is up here in Stoke. For this chapel still exists. It is now a pub, but the chapel place that was next door to it was an open space. And I'm pretty sure that's where they're doing open air preaching in the air. And this actually shows you the place. The map here dates from the 1860s, and it actually details the chapel, the Methodist chapel, Wesleyan chapel, sorry, and now it's it's the Stoke Bar and Grill. So that's a wonderful thing about maps from the air. It tells you the changes of the places as well. So we now know where Wesley was, where Wesley's place is, thanks to maps looking from the air. Also with him was George Whitefield. He was another chap, did most writings as well, with followed. So they was sort of like a pair that grouped together. He also travelled most of the country doing preaches, but he was more local, this chap, George. Right, also in the air, okay, mythical beings. Things that, well, mostly explained, you would think, especially by the today's standards in the 20th century. But now and again, some quirky things do happen. And one such thing happened up in Stoke, which was a being, a ghost seen. And it was here at the flower shop. And what happened was the lady in the flower shop was doing her flower business, and the door opened and a chap walked in with an Easter egg underneath his arm and walked straight past it and into the back where two ladies were working. Opened the door, closed the door behind him. She's chasing him up. Thought, look, you can't go in there. Opened the door. He's not there. She said to the two lady friends who were working with, did you see that bloke with the egg? No. Sure. She was going up and down, absolutely convinced, scared so much, she went home early. Could this be a ghost in the air? The other thing about being up in the Stoke was the way it was still a village. It was a place to escape from. We're talking now about the Victorian period, but when you look at some of the early paintings, you could see there's an old inn at the top. And what was well famous really for the area was lovely cider houses. I mean, we had orchards, okay, but mostly pear cider, funny enough, as well. So we had these cider houses next to the orchards, and you can actually see those in some of the maps. However, going up to Stoke, and when you consider the close proximity of Devonport and Stonehouse and also Plymouth, they were places like that were becoming very congested, overpopulated, whereas Stoke Village and Stoke area wasn't sold off. It was still rural. It still had that feeling of being a village away from all that compression, especially in Devonport with its two lines. So everybody was outside the dock wall, but inside the defensive wall and encaged in. So to get out there and break up to Stoke was like a relief. It was a breath of fresh air. The place really to have a good old drink, because there was a heck of a lot of pubs up here. And when you're in these pubs, as you can imagine, there were sea shanties, songs. One may call them an air. Many an air was sung in many of these pubs. And even in the 70s, some crews would come off the ship, have a particular pub, walk into a pub, and would trump up a song, and off they would go. Without any sort of encouragement, everybody seemed to know the words. Doesn't really happen much today. However, some of the pubs, this is the Pear Tree pub, obviously the Pear Tree orchard bang next door, as we know from an orchard, was quite renowned for meeting, let's say, the local ladies, and they would have often a little get together with farmers and local ladies. That's how they sort of met each other. There was a sort of meeting places other than church, but this is Stoke Village. Didn't have a church, unless you were down the lower part. And it was frequented, obviously, a lot by sailors then, and also Marines as well. And Marines, as you know, were acting like the police force on inside ships and acting as guards, keeping the peace in many ways. Anyway, they happened to go to this particular pub, and it had a bit of a shindig going on. Got lots of lovely ladies dancing around, and lots of drinks flying about in the air. And all of a sudden, a fight ensues, and the Marines are pushed out of the pub. However, Marines being Marines, decided to come back with reinforcements, which they did do. And as they did, they came back into the pub and oiked all the other people there, sailors and farmers, through the window. So you got flying sailors and flying farmers through the air. I know, it's a bit far-fetched, but here, hang on, it gets worse. Next one, along with the pubs, the excuse with most of the people up in going to pubs were sailors and that sort of Marines, and they had to keep preening themselves to make themselves look correct. Okay, they had to have the correct haircuts. Yes, that's right, haircuts. And it had a plethora of barbers up there, and it still has today. It's still quite a place to pubs, barbers, a few flower shops, and that's about it really up the top there. So look out for having an haircut up in Stoke. The other thing that we forget over time is how wonderful the air must have been at the top of this lovely hill way back in time. But as you know, once the railway had cut through and over into Cornwall, thanks to Brunel, and engaged people to travel more, the Devonport got bigger, more and more people were moving in, and more people were looking for places to live. And eventually the landowners gave up a lot of property once the railway had cut through the fields in the area over to housing. Now what we do forget is heating at the time was mostly coal, and coal creates smog. Now when you look at Devonport, Stonehouse and Plymouth Sutton Harbour, they would have had amounts of smoke. That's why Stoke was the place to be. But unfortunately, over time, it got engulfed with a lot of smoke to be seen. And that's from the steamships, from the trains, and also from the houses. Smoke was in the air. Pollution. Just before that, you're looking at, again, the area being a sort of place to live for the elite. They didn't want to live in Devonport, as I was saying earlier, sort of caged in, or especially Stonehouse. That was even more congested, and it was one of the poorest places to be, especially in the 18th and 19th century. And even Plymouth Sutton Harbour was still looked at as slightly, let's say, Elizabethan, and hadn't changed much at all in its parameters. And a lot of people were living in small little places, small little rooms, whole families, that sort of thing. But to be an officer or a high-ranking doctor or a person of nobility, you didn't want to live in those places. You wanted to live in a sort of like semi-stately home. You wanted to, because of your status, you wanted to be out of that zone. And to be out of that zone, you were looking at the Stoke area. So not too far away, but near enough to be at work. So some of the grand houses were built in Stoke area. And there's a series of few designs here, mostly designed by John Falston, who came over to design the Theatre Royal in about 1813, 1818. And he was then commandeered by landowners to build these grand houses. Now, they weren't for sale. They were up for rent. So if you wanted to live in some of these houses, you were paying rent to the landowner at the time, the Auburn family. Okay, so some of these big houses are long gone, unfortunately, and some of them were commandeered and made, especially after the First World War, accommodated into schools or even to sort of hostels, that sort of thing, because they were quite big houses and they had to be managed by groundsmen, that sort of thing, and really orphanages, that sort of thing. But over time, during the Second World War, a lot of these huge buildings disappeared. Some fragments of these buildings still survive, but a lot of them and their land boundaries have long gone, unfortunately. But there are some real gems to be seen in Stoke. And they wanted to be here because of the air, the landscape, away from all the hustle and bustle. And don't forget, when you look at Devonport, Stonehouse and Plymouth, it wasn't the best for sanitary, and it had awful smells. I mean, they didn't have proper sewage, that sort of thing. So you had that rancid smell. Even at Sutton Harbour, that fish smell. You had, like I was saying, smoke. But if you were out in the fields and you're hearing the birds and the trees and you breathing that fresh air, with your own sort of manor house, you had like an air to the place. It felt freedom, especially if you had the money. Other things as well. We had our ghosts. We can't explain them, but people see them. And there are other things that we can see, especially high up. I mean, that's the good fortunate thing. If you're high up, you can see overland and you can see further into the sky because nothing really is obscuring your view. You are the tallest. And that's the beauty of being at the top of Stoke Village. And this was about 1970 or 60s, 70s or somewhere around there, that a lady did spot hovering over Central Park a flying saucer. It's been noted and she drew it as well. And she wasn't the only person to see it. Quite a few people have seen flying saucers over Plymouth, but this particular one actually was sort of drawn and it told about its movements as well. So quite a few people had seen it. and especially from Stoke, from the flats at the top there, at Molesworth Road, looking over onto the park at the time. It was quite visible. What they are, we don't know, but they were up in the air. Other entertainments, like we were talking earlier about Wesley and his open air preaching. We're not forgetting that a lot of people used to travel, during the Puritan period, lots of these fellow entertainers or troops that would go around the country weren't welcome down here at all for a heck of a long while, really, until you're talking about the 18th century, that sort of period, like I was saying. 1790s, things start to change. However, what was in the military service was competition. So you had ships with competitions, shooting competitions, wrestling, and boxing was one of the most favourite things to have competitions with. And so a lot of pubs would have sort of boxing rooms. But the most popular thing was to have boxing matches in the air. Now we know there's some of them on the Hoe, we know there's some of them in Victoria Park down the bottom. But with Stoke, they had their own boxing ring up here on the park of Blockhouse. And we've got a photograph to prove that as well, which we'd love to see, because these people were sort of semi-professional boxers. Sometimes you would get professional boxers, especially from Cornwall as well. And people would like to have a gamble, have a flutter in the air with them. Also, being up here in a high promontory, you see some strange things, like okay, look at the clouds and there's a funny shape, you don't know what that is, and we take for granted today lots of these streaks going through the air, and they're planes, and we see those all the time. We just take them for granted. Birds are just going off, yeah, that's fine. But aviation was in its early days, and like I was saying, with troops of people, entertainers would come around with these strange contraptions, and one of these strange contraptions was a balloon, and it was Mrs. Graham's balloon. Mr. Graham owned the balloon, but Mrs. Graham was the aeronautist that would go up in this balloon, and it came to Plymouth. Now, she's not the best aeronautist at the time, because she seemed to have accidents no matter where she went at all. Anyway, she lifted off, the balloon lifted off in 1814, I think it's there, but I'll have a look at it again. But it was early period. It was lifted off from Stonehouse, and that could be seen from miles away because it was an unusual object, and especially from Stoke Village. Looking down from there up to the Blockhouse, you could see straight in to the sound. I mean, everything was, today we've got all the houses in the way, but then 1813, 1814, you could see that the whole area was quite empty. And seeing this huge balloon start to float up into the air with a lady inside it was quite unusual and quite spectacular. And it was like us watching a spaceship or a spacecraft going up into the air for the first time, launching off. Everybody wanted to watch this spectacular thing. It was a new fandangle thing of taking people into the air. It went up into the air. However, the wind got it. Our friend, the wind, took it away and took it into the sound. Lucky for her, the balloon hit the sea. She was picked up by the Marines, who just happened to be nearby, and her life was saved. But the balloon was dragged further on by the wind. Our friend, the wind, took it away, and she was saved. And that was seen, pretty damn sure, from Stoke. Another type of balloon, okay, now 150 odd years later, we're looking at the Second World War, and we know that the blockhouse had been a sort of a defensive feature in the 1780s, 1790s, really to defend the dockyard, and it sort of abandoned its use of military use in about the 1850s, 1860s, that sort of period, when artillery got a further range. So the blockhouse was really sort of abandoned, that sort of park. However, during the Second World War, it became useful. Again, high point. Plymouth was one of the key places for the enemy to bomb, to attack, or to destroy, especially the dockyard and especially anything, the morale of the people, as we know from the Blitz. However, being on a high promontory, you could look over the sound, you could see the oncoming enemy. And these were mostly bombers coming over. And the thing to do to attack the bombers was to try and elevate them further up into the air, push them up into the air. And what you had then was what they called barrage balloons. Now, barrage balloons in the Second World War had a nickname, Dumbo, like the Walt Disney's elephant, because that's what they looked like to kids. So the nickname was Dumbos. These were huge things of gas, and they were sort of like untamed balloons, if you like, but they had the use of pushing these planes up in the air so they can get a proper triangular directory to see how high these planes were. They didn't want to fly too low, okay? However, our friend the wind, and as you know, Stoke is quite a windy spot, did take down one of these balloons quite badly, along with its gas truck down the hill. And this picture here shows the crew that was stationed up the top there in a wooden hut that was recently taken away. But you can see in the lower photograph there, the truck being pulled down the hill and just dangling on the edge of some sort of wall. They managed to get the truck back up. It's very unusual to see a photograph of a failure or something that's bad that happened in the Second World War, because a lot of these photographs were sort of censored. So it's very unusual to see these photos. This is the hut. Also within the hut, if messages had to be sent to, as you could imagine, lots of people were riding around in bicycles and bits and pieces like that, but there was a lot of heavy flak going on. You could use our friendly pigeons, which you could train to actually send messages to further afield, much further afield, up in the air. Okay, in this photograph is also the what they were looking for with the raids from the enemy. A lot of the incendiary bombs would come down to create fires, and you could see from this high promontory up at Stoke where the fires are starting. So you could actually alert the people that, right, we need fire engines there because we know the heavy bombers are going to come later. Like I said, pigeons could be used for sending messages. Mostly bikes were used, but really pigeons came into their own. And they were still used sending messages up until the 1960s. Being out in the air, a lot of kids need today. I mean, when you go back in time, lots of children would play in the fields and things like that. And then be indoors working during the Victorian times, and then there was a time when kids could be kids, and kids like to be playing out in streets, out in the open. I come from a time when as soon as I finished school, you would be told, well, go out to play and don't come back till 6 o'clock, even if it was dark. But nowadays what I've noticed is a lot of kids are now taking part into activities, especially on the park, playing together. But there are a certain amount of people, because things have changed, that people are indoors. But being outside, creating your own games, playing in the open air, and especially with the the park, it's fantastic for flying kites. You can do a bit of stargazing at night because there's hardly any light there. It's a fantastic place to be there. It's a magical place. And it's still got that up in the air feeling, especially in the park today, because there's nothing in the way. As the population grew in the three towns, let's say, and in Stoke as well, what we did have was a plethora of, let's say, lots of children. And the school board all of a sudden put themselves together to build schools, because a lot of the schools were really tiny little places. You would have what they call rag schools and that sort of thing. So you have very poor schools, asylums, that sort of thing, or even sort of like private schools. But really, Queen Victoria decided, let's get people educated. Let's get them reading the basics rather than doing all the servant chores and things like that. Let's get them proper school training. However, by then, most of Stoke had been built on, and lots of the schools were still quite small. Luckily, in the 1880s, up to the 1920s, they started building these great big schools. But the area where they were building them, especially in Devonport and in Stonehouse, they had to think of where these play areas could be. And in Stoke, it's on top of the school. This is Stoke Damerel High School for girls, and these are pictures of the playground on top of the school. So hence you've got all the school underneath, but you're playing in the air. The other thing in the air that's amazing, really, thanks to Brunel, is these bridges. Now, normally bridges are stone, small affairs, but Brunel really achieved an amazing bridge, like the Tamar Bridge. It's one of these bridges that are way up in the air. But don't forget, he's also designed all these other bridges, wooden ones, to transverse over creeks that we take for granted. And then when you look at the early pictures like this one, you can see it's more like a Victorian fairground ride. It really is like being on a Big Dipper, in my mind, because it is quite rickety looking. You're on a tiny little train, and the early trains were quite open air, and you're up on a wooden sort of structure, sort of precariously going over these deep creeks, which are still there today, but the bridges have been redone. But they still have that air about them when you go across them, that you can see the landscape underneath you, and you're up in the air, you're looking down on them. Okay, and we've come to the end of this walk with the element of air in the Stoke Village, and I just want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed what you see.